What is the scariest thing you have seen ever? Story 1. This happened just this past weekend. I came home to find my brother passed out, and when he came to, he could barely stand or walk and was in an altered mental state, speaking like he was drunk. He had not eaten or drunk anything but water for 3 days and had been sleeping almost nonstop. It turned out he was diabetic and was experiencing diabetic ketoacidosis. He spent the weekend in the intensive care unit. He passed out because he was so dehydrated that his heart could not properly pump blood, his blood pressure was dropping, and his heart rate was skyrocketing. His blood glucose level was extremely high. He is doing better now, thankfully, but at that moment, I thought I was watching my big brother, my best friend, die right in front of me. Story 2. I was a truck driver back in 2012. One night I was driving along the interstate when I saw what looked like a large black dog jump from the right shoulder into my lane, and I slammed into it. The truck shuddered violently, and the two refrigerators, my microwave, my printer, and most of my clothes all came crashing down from the top bunk. I saw the front hood literally pop up, blocking my view for an instant before slamming back down. Keep in mind, these hoods are hinged at the front and tilt forward to open, but this time it tilted backward like a normal car would, which meant the hood was ripped from its hinges. I was fully loaded with almost 80,000 pounds of cargo, 4 massive paper rolls, and the impact slowed me down from 55 miles per hour to about 30, while the engine was still chugging in 10th gear. Instantly, I figured I must have hit a bear. To my surprise, the headlights were still working, and a quick check of the gauges showed everything was still functioning for the moment, and the truck was still driving normally. I was not about to stop in case there were more bears around. Even if a tire went flat, you would be surprised how far you can drive on one in a truck. So I turned on my hazard lights and warned everyone on the CB radio that I had just run over a literal bear. I had to clarify because bear is slang for police on CB. About 5 miles later, I pulled into a truck stop, eyes glued to the temperature gauge the entire time, expecting to lose coolant and overheat. When I got out to check the damage, to my horror, the truck was in perfect condition, not a scratch. The fiberglass front end was untouched. The hood was fine, the hinge intact, radiator and intercooler perfect. But the mess in the cab proved something had happened. I almost fainted with fear. That sinking feeling you get when a roller coaster tips over the edge? It was like that, but 100 times worse. I drove out of there as fast as possible, even going over my legal hours, just to get out of the state. Later, I found out about an old trucker legend of the black dog. They say the black dog jumps in front of trucks, causing crashes when drivers swerve to avoid it. Thankfully, in trucking school, we are taught never to swerve or brake hard to avoid a crash, because ramming is safer than flipping an 80,000-pound truck onto a car. The next morning, I checked my load, and strangely, the paper rolls had not shifted at all. Usually, they load 2 toward the front, about 6 feet from the wall, and 2 closer to the rear to balance the weight. Even a hard stop is enough to make them slide forward and press all their weight onto the rear tires, but they had not moved an inch, which is impossible. Then I got a call asking if I had been in an accident because the truck's onboard accelerometer recorded a huge impact and a sudden deceleration from 55 miles per hour to 30 in less than a second. But the radar did not detect anything or apply the brakes, so they assumed it was a glitch. I explained the whole situation and even sent pictures of the trashed cab, though the truck itself was untouched and the load had not shifted. They had me stop at a nearby shop for inspection, and everything came back perfect. I will never know what truly happened that night. Story 3. My wife and I were driving down the interstate behind a truck that was pulling a trailer full of junk. An old wheel and tire came off, bounced a couple of times, and then shot straight at us. There have been many times in my life where everything seemed to slow down. Every other time I was able to calmly collect my thoughts and do what needed to be done. I am a nurse, and people's lives have been saved because of that ability. But this was the only time when I could not think of a single thing to do, and I started to mentally prepare myself for the reality that this tire hitting me in the face might be the end of my life. I turned the wheel just enough so that I would take the brunt of the hit instead of my wife. Then I just waited and hoped the impact would not kill her too. The sound when it hit was one of the loudest noises I have ever heard as it smashed into our windshield. Thankfully, it also crushed the metal roof, which absorbed much of the impact and prevented the wheel from going all the way through the glass. We ended up cut and bruised, but we survived. Whoever was driving the truck sped off and left us there, and they were never found. Story 4. It was the spring of 1995. I was flying back from San Antonio on maybe my 10th trip there. By this point, I had probably flown around 50 times, so I thought of myself as a seasoned traveler. I was on American Airlines. The first flight took me from San Antonio to Dallas, which is the hub for American Airlines. Before my connecting flight to Des Moines could take off, a nasty thunderstorm rolled in. Even so, we all boarded the plane and sat on the tarmac waiting for clearance. 3 hours passed. I had a clear view of one of the windsocks, and it was flailing at a 45-degree angle most of that time. When the captain finally announced that we could take off, the windsock was stretched completely horizontal and the storm was at its peak. We took off, buffeted by powerful winds all the way down the runway. 15 seconds after liftoff, the plane dropped for a good 5 seconds straight. The aircraft fought hard to gain altitude but kept plunging again and again. It was terrifying. I gripped the bottom of my seat because I thought my seatbelt might not hold. I remember looking up the aisle during one of the drops and watching the front of the plane suddenly dip at about a 45-degree angle, while inertia kept my head frozen in place. Back then, seats had phones built into them, and after about 5 minutes of that chaos, I decided I would call my wife to say goodbye. It took me nearly a minute just to grab the phone because I had to brace one arm with the other to pull it out of the seat in front of me. After several tries, I finally managed to punch in our number along with my credit card information, but of course, all I reached was our answering machine. The turbulence continued relentlessly. The plane would climb desperately for about 15 seconds, then drop again for 5. The captain came on and said this would last for 20 minutes until we broke out of the storm near Oklahoma. That is exactly how long it went on. Eventually, once we reached smoother air over Missouri, I struck up a conversation with one of the flight attendants. She told me it was the worst turbulence she had ever experienced. She looked to be in her 40s, so I figured she must have gone through plenty of rough flights before, which made her comment even more unsettling. About 2 weeks later, I received a letter from American Airlines. It was obviously edited by lawyers, but it was clearly an apology letter. I regret not saving it. Story 5. The Sydney siege was a big one for me. I did not see it firsthand, but I went to school close to the city, and when the news broke, we were not allowed to leave once school ended. My aunt was the regional manager for all the Lint cafes in New South Wales, and my first thought was whether she was safe. Luckily, she was not at the cafe at the time, but she did not respond to our calls or texts all day, and we were worried sick. It turned out the gunman was using the store manager's phone to communicate with her and negotiate with police, so the police had her phone the entire time. She was very close with the store manager who lost his life and had received a message from him with his final words before it happened. We did not see or speak to her for months afterward, as I think she was in shock. I cannot imagine how difficult that was for her. Another frightening moment was witnessing my grandmother have a panic attack on her deathbed. People sometimes know when they are near the end, and it is not easy to witness. She kept repeating, "I do not want to go," over and over again. Story 6. I was moving out of my old house into a new one about 20 minutes away on the highway. We were having the first real snowstorm of the year, and since we were in a cargo van rental, we avoided the highway and took the back roads instead. About halfway there, as we pulled away from a stop sign, I saw headlights drifting into our lane. I shouted to my fiancée, who was driving, but it was too late, and the car hit us head on. I got out to check our damage, but saw that the other car had ended up in a snowbank, still revving. I ran to the window and saw a woman with her head slumped back. I banged on the glass and yelled, but she did not move. I shouted for someone to call the police, but nobody did, so I stepped back and called myself. While I was struggling to get the words out to dispatch, a man pulled up behind us. I told him to try breaking the window. He could not, so he ran back to his car, grabbed a tire iron, and smashed out the back window. We finally got her car turned off. I checked for a pulse. Nothing. The police arrived soon after, and while I stood there explaining what happened, they found a pipe on the driver's side floor and suspected an overdose. They gave her 2 doses of naloxone and rushed her into the ambulance. At first, I thought she had died on impact from the crash, but it turned out she may have already been gone when she hit us. I never found out if she survived. This happened back in February. Story 7. I was riding home from a friend's house late on a Friday night with my brother driving. The road was 3 lanes across and stretched about 15 miles through town. For several miles, there was a man on a sport motorcycle riding in the lane to our right. I kept noticing him as I stared out the window, and I remember thinking it was not safe that he was not wearing a helmet. Florida does not require them. Within 2 minutes of that thought, as we approached an overpass, an SUV ran a red turn light in front of us, and the motorcyclist slammed into its side. I saw the whole thing and yelled at my brother to turn around as I called emergency services. By the time we made it back, I was still on the phone, and a few other people had pulled over as well. My first aid training immediately took over, and I found myself directing the scene. He was conscious but very confused, with blood coming from his nose, and I suspected head or neck injuries. Following the operator's instructions, we kept him on the ground and made sure he did not move his neck. He was scraped up but had no other visible injuries. I asked his name and explained that he had been in an accident and that help was on the way. The SUV that hit him drove off. I still cannot remember what type of car it was or its color. Since it was a hit and run, I had to give a statement to the police. I have never felt that kind of adrenaline. It could have ended so much worse. Story 8. My ex struggled with depression, anxiety, and thoughts of ending her life because of her abusive father. It was absolutely terrifying the first time I saw her have a panic attack. I had nightmares about them, where I would see her crying, and when I went up to comfort her, she would stare at me with those cold, empty eyes. 1,000-yard stare so deep, it seemed like she had no awareness of reality. Then all of a sudden, she would recognize me, and that emptiness would turn into the most intense terror I had ever seen. I had that dream several times while we were dating, and it never got less frightening, especially because in real life, when I tried to comfort her, I sometimes made things worse. In reality, it was just as scary when I saw new scars on her arms. One day she handed me something from her closed fist, telling me she needed me to keep it. When she pulled her hand away, I saw it was a razor blade, and that was when I noticed the fresh cuts on her wrists. There were days I would drive her home from school, and she would tell me about her recent dark thoughts. I tried to be strong for her, but after dropping her off, I would pull around the corner where she could not see me, park, and just cry. Then once I got home, I would cry myself to sleep. It was incredibly difficult. I felt like I had no idea how to help her. We had plenty of good times together too, and I do not regret the relationship, but those moments were some of the hardest things I have ever gone through. Story 9. My mom was in an intensive care bed after a 10-hour open-heart surgery. The night before, she had asked me to visit and talk to her because she was afraid and anxious. I dreaded that entire day until I finally got the call that the surgery was over and I could see her. I made the 30-minute drive to the hospital, hyping myself up while calling family to update them. I picked up flowers and a card on the way. As I walked toward her room, my heart started pounding. Standing at the curtain, I knew that once I pulled it aside, I might not be ready for what I was about to see. I moved it, and there was my mom, eyes rolled back, a tube down her throat, her tongue hanging out, hooked up to machines that pumped her heart and lungs, making her body jerk like she was convulsing. There was a huge incision down her chest. I broke down sobbing and held her hand for as long as I was allowed to stay. She does not remember any of it. Sometimes I wish I had not seen her like that, because it hit me so hard. Now that she is doing better, I get upset whenever I see her not taking care of herself, because I cannot handle the thought of seeing her like that again. She looked exactly like my uncle did when he was on his deathbed. Story 10. I was 15 when my appendix became inflamed. It was supposed to be nothing serious, just a minor surgery to remove it before it burst. I had heard appendix removals were 99% successful, so my parents and I were not worried. I went into surgery, but apparently a trainee doctor accidentally cut a blood vessel in my intestines without noticing. They stitched me up and declared me fine. While I was recovering, my stomach filled with blood. My entire body shriveled up, and almost all of my blood pooled in my abdomen. A nurse noticed and tried to get doctors, but since it was around 2 in the morning, no one came at first. She kept insisting until finally doctors checked and found me pale as a ghost, with a stomach swollen, like I was 9 months pregnant. Suddenly, the entire hospital was in chaos, with every surgeon rushing in to operate. They had to remove all my organs just to find the tiny cut in the vessel. I lost about 80% of my blood. I needed 9 transfusions and was only 2 minutes away from bleeding out. I went in thinking it was a simple procedure and that I would wake up the next morning. But instead, I did not wake up for 3 days. When I did, I was immobile with a massive scar running from my stomach up my chest. I cannot imagine what my parents went through. They were made to wait in the chapel while I was taken in for the life-saving surgery. The hospital had to change its entire surgical policy after that. It is frightening to think about how close I came to dying, but it taught me to appreciate life much more. Now I am 18 and doing well. Story 11. When our neighbor's house caught fire, my dad was in his room while my brother and I were in the living room watching television. We heard a knock at the door, and when I answered, it was the neighbor's 3 daughters. The middle one told me to get my dad quickly because their house was on fire. Their mom was not home, and they did not have a phone. I looked toward their house but did not see anything at first. Still, I ran to wake my dad. He was asleep and confused as I tried to explain. Panicked, I grabbed a bucket of water while my brother followed me outside. When I stepped out, the front of their house looked fine, but the girls were shouting that the fire was in the back. I ran there and saw the entire back of the house engulfed in flames. My little bucket of water was useless. I threw it on nothing and ran back to get my dad. He had already called emergency services. I asked the girls if anyone was still inside, and they said just their puppy. They had left it behind. By then, the fire was spreading toward the front of the house. It was one of the scariest nights of my life. If it had been windy that day, our own house could have caught fire. The window in my room shattered from the heat, and our fence caught fire too. Story 12. I witnessed a man lose his life at a party for simply trying to stop a fight. One guy had been aggressive the whole night and eventually picked on a quiet, polite kid who clearly wanted no trouble. A tall, muscular man, someone I had just met that night, who looked intimidating but was incredibly kind, stepped in. He threw the aggressive guy onto the grass and told him to stop or leave. After a tense stare, the tall man walked away, but the aggressive guy pulled a knife, ran up behind him, and stabbed him once between the ribs before fleeing. The man was rushed to the hospital by car, but he did not survive. The knife punctured his lung, and the nearest hospital was 30 minutes away. I saw the entire thing in disbelief. Earlier that night, the same aggressive guy had tried to start a fight with me by stealing a cigar and a pack of cigarettes he thought were mine, daring me to take them back. I ignored him, too busy talking to a girl. 20 minutes later, he stabbed someone else. It was terrifying, not just because I watched a good man lose his life for defending another, but also because I realized it could have been me if I had taken the bait. Story 13. When I was 5 years old, I watched my mom suffer a brain aneurysm right in front of my sister and me. We were sorting her Girl Scout cookies when, mid-sentence, her eyes rolled back and she collapsed, unresponsive. I had just learned in kindergarten what to do in an emergency and went to call emergency services. But my older sister, who was 7 or 8, panicked and grabbed the phone screaming, "She's just sleeping!" I think she was terrified that calling for help would make it real. Thankfully, my mom woke up a little while later, called my dad, and he called for help. She had surgery the next day and spent months in the hospital. I even had my 6th birthday in her hospital room, surrounded by balloons and life support machines. That image is burned into my mind, and to this day, birthdays make me uncomfortable. My parents tried to cheer me up the following year by taking me to a water park, but it got canceled due to snow. Ever since, I tend to keep my birthday quiet to avoid disappointment and painful memories. The odds of surviving both a brain aneurysm and the surgery to repair it are incredibly slim, so I feel very fortunate that she is alive today, 20 years later. That was my first clear memory, and it shaped both my sister and me deeply. She is now a doctor, and I cannot help but believe that experience was a big part of why she chose that path. Story 14. This happened the year after my girlfriend and I started dating. It was Christmas Eve, and I was at my aunt's house celebrating while texting my girlfriend as usual. It was late, and she told me how tired she was. When she stopped texting, I assumed she had fallen asleep and went home to get ready for Christmas Day. The next morning, I had not heard from her, which was not too unusual, except her aunt texted me asking if I knew where she was. I told her she had been at home the last time I heard from her. Around 11 in the morning, after we finished opening gifts, I drove to her house to give her her present. To my shock, when I turned the corner, I saw nothing but a smoking pile of ash where her house had been. It took me a moment to process, and then my blood ran cold. I drove home and told my parents what I had seen, trying hard not to break down. About 3 hours later, she showed up at my door and told me there had been a fire in the middle of the night. She had barely woken up in time to escape and had been staying in a motel in the next town since. Everyone got out safely except for her cat, who did not survive. Fast forward about 4 years, and whenever we drive by the empty lot where her house once stood, we both still get chills. Story 15. When I was around 16 or 17, I was driving down a gravel road in the winter. The vehicle in front of me was going extremely slow, slower than necessary to be safe, around 5 to 10 miles per hour. The road was about 5 miles long, and I was frustrated because I had a curfew and knew I would end up 40 minutes late, likely getting grounded. The driver stayed cautious for almost the entire road, but as we approached the last hill, she suddenly sped up to about 40 miles per hour. My heart sank because I knew that just over that hill was a T intersection, and there was no way she could make the turn at that speed. On the other side of the intersection was a 20-foot embankment covered in trees. I did not see her go over because I was still on the hill, driving carefully on the slick road. But as soon as I came over the top, I saw my assumption was right. Her car had gone down, and I could see red tail lights glowing faintly through the smoke and steam. I stopped in the safest spot I could, called emergency services, and knew it would take at least 15 minutes for anyone to arrive that far out. Then I scrambled down through the snow, wearing only gym shorts, a t-shirt, and tennis shoes, tearing through branches until I reached the car. She was bleeding from her head but conscious. I told her not to worry and that help was coming. She quickly insisted, "No, don't call the police, just help me push my car out." That was when I realized she was likely very drunk. The smell inside the car made that clear. I tried to stay with her, but she kept pressuring me to help her get the car back on the road. I decided it was better to wait for emergency responders and told her to hang tight while I moved my car. Eventually help arrived and they took over. I stayed to give a statement, and when I got back to my car, I found the battery had died because I had left my lights on the entire time. Luckily, a farmer who had brought his tractor to help pull her car out gave me a jump start. I never found out what happened to her afterward, or even who she was. But when I finally got home, my mom was annoyed with what she thought was my phony excuse for being so late. Story 16. I was stuck in traffic, getting irritated, when I noticed something unusual. I leaned out of my car, trying to get a better look, when suddenly I saw a girl crossing the street get hit hard by a car. She went down, and her teeth scattered across the pavement. She was clearly not okay, disoriented, probably with a concussion. She begged not to be taken to the hospital because she could not afford the ambulance ride, but thankfully a nurse on the scene convinced her. Everyone else drifted away afterward, but her boyfriend had been across the street at an auto store. When he realized what happened, he went into shock and started having a panic attack. Nobody seemed to care about his panic, so I stayed with him and helped calm him down. I still felt awful for the girl. Later that same day, because of a 20-second delay in my commute, I came across the aftermath of another accident. Two motorcyclists lay on the road with severe head injuries, blood pooling from their ears. It was surreal. 50 cars stopped, nurses in scrubs jumped out of their vehicles to help, and others directed traffic until emergency responders arrived. What struck me most was seeing these men, who probably had all the leather, muscle, and tough guy image, lying so still and lifeless. In our town, we had bumper stickers and signs everywhere saying, "Watch for motorcycles." And yet, here they were. It was a freak accident, and it still haunts me. And as if that day wasn't enough, there was also a tornado. Story 17. I was riding the school bus home when I was in 7th or 8th grade. After turning onto the road toward my stop, the kid sitting behind me suddenly pulled a plastic bag over my head. I remember not being able to breathe, clawing at the bag until I finally ripped it open with my fingers. When I looked around, the kids I thought were my friends were laughing. They thought it was funny watching me nearly suffocate. These were young teens, 14 to 16 years old, raised in poverty and surrounded by gangs and violence, where compassion was seen as weakness. No one stepped in to help. That was one of the scariest moments of my life, and it changed me deeply. Because of that and other traumatic events, I suffered with post-traumatic stress for over 10 years and turned to alcohol, cigarettes, and substances to cope. But with therapy, I eventually got clean, learned to forgive those who stood by, and even forgave the kid who put the bag over my head. Story 18. I have been a nurse for 7 years, and the most frightening thing I have ever seen is pneumonia caused by COVID-19. Patients went from being independent people to confused, terrified, and alone as their bodies failed. I cannot count how many video calls I had to set up so families could say goodbye. I had patients beg me not to let them die. Families sobbed over the phone, desperate to see their loved ones. Patients told me through tears that they just wanted to go home, but I could not give them that. Nothing I did seemed enough. Either they fought it off or they did not. I held their gloved hands, read them texts, showed them pictures while they lay face down for days on machines forcing oxygen into their lungs. Lying on their backs would have killed them. Walking down the hall, all I could hear were the sounds of those machines and the faint broken whisper of someone saying, "Help me." I thought, this is hell. I am in hell. I nearly had a panic attack, and I had never had one before. Until COVID, I had no history of anxiety or depression. But now so many healthcare workers are carrying complex trauma from that time, and in America, mental health services are barely accessible. We never even received hazard pay. I still have nightmares. I cannot relax even around vaccinated friends indoors. My appetite is gone. I barely sleep, and I fall into heavy funks of depression. The worst part is the futility. I did everything I could, but they still died. Story 19. I was about 15 years old when I went for a walk to the river. On my way back home, a man pulled over and asked if I was lost. I told him no, that I lived nearby. He then asked if I needed a ride home. Again, I said no, that I wanted to walk. He repeated the question about being lost and offering a ride, and that was the moment I knew something was wrong. I refused again, and his expression completely changed. His face almost looked like a different person's. Fear shot through me. I scanned the road, thinking about where I could run. No houses were close enough. My only option would have been to sprint into the woods and swim across the river. For a few seconds, we stared at each other, both knowing this was not going to end easily. Then I noticed a car coming down the road. I was about to wave and scream when he followed my gaze, saw the car, and looked back at me with an expression of pure anger and hatred I cannot describe. Then he sped off. I stood frozen for a few moments, trying to process what had just happened. He was driving a normal light-colored sedan, and he looked like any ordinary middle-aged man. Blonde, thinning hair, blue eyes. Someone you would never suspect. I ran home quickly and never walked to the river alone again. I used to go there often after my brother passed away, since it was our fishing spot. I will never forget the look in that man's eyes. Even now, a decade later, my heart pounds and my hands sweat just thinking about it. Story 20. My older brother struggled with serious problems, and one time he snapped and attacked me. He started pummeling me, then turned on my mother, all while his children, my sister, and her friend were in the living room watching. My mother tried to stop him, but he flung her aside like she was weightless and kept hitting her. I ran to my room, grabbed my 8mm rifle, loaded a single bullet, and came back pointing it at him. He stopped hitting her and turned to me. He pressed his chest against the barrel and taunted me, saying I was too weak to pull the trigger. I flipped off the safety and told him, "Do you want to bet?" He eventually went out the door and I locked it. He came back pounding on it, demanding his kids. I told him if he went back to his Jeep, I would let them out, and after a tense back and forth, he agreed. I sent the kids outside. Years later, almost a decade after I had last seen him, his first words to me were, "It's a good thing you locked that door." I went to my Jeep to get my revolver and was coming back to kill all of you. That confirmed what I had always known. My brother has no conscience. Growing up with a sibling like that is its own kind of fear. I still have a scar on my forehead from when he once shot me point blank with a BB gun. Story 21. When I worked as a semi-truck tire technician, I saw a coworker get pinned under the tires of a flatbed trailer after a jack stand failed while he was putting a tire back on. For those who do not know, semi-truck tires are mounted by sitting on the ground with your legs on either side of the tire and using your legs to help lift it up onto the studs to avoid ruining your back. When the jack failed, the massive trailer came down on his legs. The terrifying part was that he ended up surviving with just bruises. He was not an average-sized man. He was enormous, about 7 feet 2 inches tall, with a body and bone structure to match. Several thousand pounds came down on his legs, but nothing broke. We scrambled to get another jack, lifted the trailer, and he managed to crawl out under his own power. He was in pain and shaken, but able to stand. After a few days of healing, he was back to work. If it had been anyone else, their legs would have been crushed beyond saving. I will never forget the sound of his scream when it happened. That surge of adrenaline was unlike anything I had ever felt. Story 22. When I was in 3rd grade, my sister and I usually walked to the bus stop together. One morning she was sick, so I had to go alone at about 6:30. The sky was still dim, the sun barely rising. I reached the bus stop and sat down, waiting. Then I noticed something far down the block. A figure. I squinted, and as it came into view, I realized it was completely white, moving in a strange, chaotic way. Not like any kind of dance, more like random flailing. Fear gripped me as I watched. After a couple of minutes, the figure suddenly froze as though it noticed me. It stared for about a minute, then moved behind a street pole and disappeared. I thought there was no way a person could hide perfectly behind a pole like that. Then its head slowly peeked around the pole, staring right at me. I was frozen in shock, nearly in tears when the bus finally arrived. And just like that, it was gone. To this day, I do not know what that figure was or why it was watching me. Story 23. The first moment that comes to mind is when my sister slipped off a moving truck. Between the height, the sound of her body hitting the bumper, and the fact that she landed right near the trailer hitch, I truly thought I had just watched her become paralyzed or even die. I ran to her in pure panic, but to my relief, she got back up. Later, she told me that was the moment she knew I really loved her, because she had never heard such fear in my voice before. It only lasted about 10 seconds, but in that moment, I was absolutely terrified. The second moment was during the first week of the pandemic lockdown in New York City. Unsettling doesn't even begin to describe what it felt like. The city was silent and empty. Stores closed, streets deserted, nothing but endless sirens echoing through the night. All we could do was stay inside, watch the governor's briefings, read the numbers rise, and pray that we had cut off exposure in time. Those first 2 weeks of waiting to see if symptoms would show were like a nightmare. The morgue trucks were horrifying as well, but thankfully I only saw them in passing, never open. Story 24. I thought my son had died. Twice in one night. He had a motorbike accident, and I was told to meet the ambulance at the gates of a spinal injury hospital. When I saw him lying motionless on a stretcher, pale and bloodless, I assumed he was already gone. I took his hand and kissed his cheek. Then, to my shock, he turned his head and whispered, "Are you okay, Mom?" It turned out the accident had happened right outside the hospital. They had not taken him in yet because he was unsure if our new insurance waiting period had passed. It had not, so he was sent to a state hospital instead. The designated hospital was in one of the most violent areas at the time, and I was already terrified. Security required passing through multiple bulletproof booths with searches before entering. When I arrived, there was chaos outside. A small riot, someone stabbed in the crowd, blood everywhere, and guards safely behind glass. I used my stern mother voice to calm people into a line, which got me through first. Inside, my son lay unattended, paler than ever, barely able to whisper through his pain. They had not given him anything because he had not yet been seen. I was certain he was bleeding internally, and I was powerless. Hours passed. Then 3 stretchers were rushed in, men drenched in blood, one clutching his stomach, another spurting from his chest, the last with a head injury so severe blood poured off the gurney. A 4th man, covered head to toe in blood, staggered behind. Moments later, alarms blared. "Lock down! Lock down!" He bolted, screaming and threatening everyone as police chased him, while doctors tried to decide how to treat the victims. All 3 died. My husband later told me he had seen them being rolled from the car, blood pouring onto the ground. My son miraculously had no internal injuries. He was discharged into my care and treated later for sprains, bruises, and a torn muscle. I tried to stay busy straightening blankets and holding hands because I was shaking with fear. I still have nightmares of my son lying there, locked out of care, begging me for relief from the pain. This was over 15 years ago, and things may have changed since then, but that night will always stay with me. In South Africa, our public healthcare system, though strained and under-equipped, is free or income-based. Seeing online how Americans can be left without care, if uninsured, makes me feel even more horrified by the thought. Because at least, for all its flaws, here my son was treated. Story 25. This is a tie between two experiences. I used to struggle with heavy addiction, spending much of my time lying on couches in substance houses, watching life fall apart around me. One day I got caught up in the execution of a low-level dealer who had started selling to kids, some of whom lost their lives. He was drawing too much attention, and I witnessed him answer the door before his head was blown apart. The kitchen behind him was splattered, and just like that, he was gone. Removed from the world in a horrific way. That moment shook me, and it was around then that I began the process of sobering up. Later, among my group of ex-addict friends, I lost many people over the years. One was found lifeless in an alley, and I could not even attend his funeral because he lived far away. But the hardest was another close friend who kept relapsing. We tried to help him, eventually settling on something we thought was safer. One day he bought a cheap, dirty batch. To make up for the low quality, it had been laced with something he had never tried before. He had a severe allergic reaction and nearly shut down. We rushed him to the hospital where he lingered for weeks, slipping in and out. His family refused to visit. Eventually, I was the one allowed in. I will never forget seeing his face contorted in pain, hearing his whimpers, and smelling the fear in his sweat. He passed away that afternoon. It was horrifying to stand so close, watching someone I cared about struggle and fade, knowing I could do nothing. It felt like watching a train bearing down on him, unable to stop it, only deciding whether to keep my eyes open and face it or close them and pretend it was not happening. Story 26. I once watched my 9-year-old daughter nearly die while we were on holiday in France. She had appendicitis that progressed to peritonitis. The first doctor we saw insisted it was just a urinary infection, gave her antibiotics, and told us to bring her back in 3 days if she was still unwell. Within 12 hours, she was almost gone. We decided we could not wait, so we took her to the hospital. They immediately transferred us to another hospital an hour away, and by the time we arrived, she was very sick. She was vomiting green fluid and drifting in and out of consciousness. I will never forget the look on the surgeon's face as he shouted into the phone, trying to get her into the operating room. My wife completely shut down, unable to cope, and at the nurse's suggestion, I sent her back to the campsite with our other children. After surgery, a nurse told me, "Be strong. It's going to be a very long night. She might not make it." That night and the following 48 hours were the most terrifying of my life. Thankfully, she survived. She spent a week in a French hospital before we could bring her home, and then months recovering slowly. She is 18 now, full of life, and writing this still brings me to tears. Story 27. When I was about 11 or 12, my parents had a small woodshed about 30 feet from the corner of our house. We burned a lot of wood in the winter, usually buying 3 cords at a time, and I was often the one to haul it back on a wagon every few days. One night, just like usual, I went to fetch wood for the rack on the back porch. The shed light had burned out, so I used a small battery lantern that barely worked. I set it down behind me on the woodpile as I stood in the doorframe, which had no door. The stacks of wood went all the way up to the 8-foot ceiling on either side, with the back crammed full of wheelbarrows, dog hay, and buckets of paint. I tossed a few pieces into the wagon when something caught my eye. In the far corner, I saw a shadow shifting unnaturally. The dim lantern light grew just bright enough for me to make out what looked like scared darkness in an inhuman shape. The only clear feature was a pair of wide, looming eyes. The figure seemed to vibrate, like it was shivering, but there was no sound, no breathing, nothing. I froze, staring. Unlike most tricks of the imagination, it did not fade when I looked harder. It was there. It felt real. The longest seconds of my life stretched on as those eyes tilted, almost like a confused child's head. That was enough. I bolted, nearly tripping over the wagon and sprinting across the entire lawn in what felt like a single leap. I slammed the back door shut, locked it, and just stood there shaking. My sister, the only other one home, looked at me wide-eyed and said, "Dude, your eyes are like bowling balls. What's wrong?" Story 28. Back in 2013, my dad and I used to ride motorcycles. One night after dinner with the family, my older cousin, who had never been on a motorcycle before, asked me for a ride back to our parents' house. I had a spare helmet, so I agreed. It was only a few miles away, so I planned to take the longer way. A few minutes in, I noticed my dad following us on his bike. He had on boots, jeans, a jacket, gloves, everything except a helmet. He sped up, cut between two cars, and passed me on the right going about 60 miles per hour. He swerved into the far left lane, about 150 feet in front of me, when it happened. A median appeared for a left turn lane, but with the sun just set and the light fading, he did not see it. Time slowed. The back end of his bike lifted high, his hands flew up, and the motorcycle came down directly on top of him. He was slammed into the median, then rolled lifelessly into the road as traffic swerved frantically to avoid him. His bike skidded to a stop just before hitting him again. My cousin panicked behind me and nearly caused me to lose control, but I managed to pull into a parking lot across the street. I told her to get help and ran toward my dad's body, convinced he was gone. To my shock, he was still breathing, shallow and quick. Blood poured from a deep gash on the back of his head and from several torn spots on his legs. I held his hand, tried to comfort him, and pressed down on his head wound to slow the bleeding. Thankfully, a fire station was nearby, and emergency responders arrived quickly, getting him into an ambulance and to a trauma center. Amazingly, he recovered within a few weeks. He no longer rides motorcycles and has some issues with short-term memory, but considering what happened, he is lucky to be alive. Story 29. I once saw a classmate nearly get impaled by a guardrail. We were crossing at a zebra crossing with guardrails on both sides when a car suddenly sped up and swerved toward us. In that moment, everything slowed down, and I could see the possible outcomes flashing in my head. I thought about running across, but knew I might not make it, or backing against the wall, but the car might have jumped the curb. Then I remembered something I had once seen on a science show about collisions, that if you are about to be hit, you should jump to avoid being dragged under the car. As I braced myself, I noticed my classmate frozen in fear just behind the guardrail. She was completely still, and I knew if she stayed there, she would be pinned. I grabbed her and pulled her away so I would take the hit instead. I jumped, landed on the hood, and rolled off. The only injury I walked away with was a bruise on my hip from the impact. When I looked back, the guardrail had been bent at a 90-degree angle into the wall. If I hadn't pulled her, she would have been impaled. I honestly think the heavy textbooks in my backpack cushioned me and saved my back from serious injury. Story 30. During my first semester at university, a man was stabbed in the stomach inside our flat at 4 in the morning. My mom is a nurse, so instinctively I went into first aid mode, along with one of my flatmates. We tried to keep him alive, following instructions from emergency dispatch over the phone. The scariest part was not the blood. It was knowing that the man who had stabbed him was still in our flat. He had locked himself inside one of the bedrooms, and for 30 long minutes before police arrived, he could have come out at any moment. I didn't allow myself to think about it at the time. I was completely focused on keeping pressure on the wound and monitoring his breathing. He survived, thankfully, but the incident left me with post-traumatic stress. For years afterward, certain triggers could send me into panic attacks, though now it rarely happens. Another terrifying moment was watching the Paris attacks unfold live on television with my housemate. I had never seen anything like that before. I was too young to remember the events of September 11th. We sat there frozen, messaging friends who might have been in France, desperate to know they were safe. One of our housemates' friends lived just 10 minutes from the street where the attacks took place, and the hours of waiting to hear back from her were filled with dread. She turned out to be safe, but that night none of us slept well. It was one of the most unsettling nights of my life. Story 31. I used to work as a bank teller, and one day a man came in asking to see a financial advisor. They went into the office together, and none of us knew that he had threatened the advisor, demanding $10,000 or he would kill him. A few minutes later, the advisor brought the man to my till, and I cheerfully greeted him, thinking he was a regular client. As I logged into my computer, he suddenly asked, "You just called for help, didn't you?" I had no idea what he meant and was confused. Meanwhile, the advisor had gone to the cash cage in the back, where large sums were kept, and anxiously asked the operator for $10,000. She didn't realize it was a robbery and refused because he wasn't following proper procedures. At that moment, the robber pulled out a gun and pointed it directly at me. That was when I realized what was happening. He told me to get him $10,000 by the time he counted down from 10. As he counted, I froze in sheer terror, my body pressing against the wall as though I could disappear into it. I would have given him my till, but we never kept that much money in them. When he reached zero and nothing happened, he stared at me, then calmly told me not to be afraid and started counting down again. He did this 3 times before the advisor finally returned with the cash. The robber then put the gun away, thanked us as though it had been a normal transaction, and walked out. Afterward, I ran into the back room, cried out that we had been robbed, and vomited as we called the police. They later told us he had committed several robberies in the past 2 weeks, but our bank was his last. Because he had lingered for over 20 minutes, the cameras captured him clearly, and police identified and arrested him within a day. The gun turned out to be fake, but I will never forget the helplessness of having it pointed at me. I was robbed 3 times while working in banks, all of them violent, but this one was the most personal and terrifying. I am grateful I no longer work in that job. Story 32. After an argument with my dad while I was recovering from a kidney infection, he forced me out of the car and made me walk home. When I finally got back, he was blasting music, and I immediately felt something was wrong. His office door was locked, and he was slurring apologies from the other side. My sister and her fiancé helped me break down the door when he wouldn't answer. Inside, I found him bleeding from multiple stab wounds to his own head, having overdosed on bottles of prescription pills. He had even taped a gun to his hand and was threatening to shoot my sister's fiancé if he didn't leave. I had already called the police, and thankfully they arrived quickly. We managed to get out of the house, and moments later, I heard 2 gunshots. I fell to my knees, convinced he was dead. But his gun had malfunctioned. It missed him, and instead blew out his office window. Somehow he survived that night. I got to live with him for another 2 years before he tried again, and this time succeeded. I was the one who found him unresponsive. That moment, and the guilt of feeling like I could have prevented it, haunts me every single day. It will always be the scariest and most heartbreaking thing I have ever lived through. Story 33. I was about 15 years old, growing up in a small town where there was not much to do, so we made our own entertainment, no matter how reckless it was. My friend lived near a train bridge, about 150 feet long, and one day we decided to go there and throw things into the creek below. At first it was just rocks and random junk, watching them splash in the water. Then my friend's older brother and his girlfriend showed up by the creek, and we decided to put on a show. That meant finding bigger and bigger things to toss. After about an hour, we were bored again, but wanted one grand finale. We spotted an old railroad tie lying nearby and thought it would be perfect. The problem was, it was way too heavy to carry to the middle of the bridge. Our brilliant idea: lay it across the tracks and push it into place. You can already guess where this is going. We were just a few feet from the spot we wanted when I happened to look up and saw a train barreling straight at us. Ever seen the movie Stand By Me? Yeah, it was like that. I screamed, "Train!" and we bolted. There was no time to move the tie, no chance to fix what we had done. We sprinted off the tracks, slid down the hill, and turned just in time to see the train smash into the tie. For those 30 seconds between spotting it and hitting the ground, my mind convinced me we had caused a train wreck, that dozens of people were about to die because of us. Instead, the tie exploded into splinters. The train roared on as if nothing had happened, and the engineer flipped us off while passing. We laughed and cheered in relief, but I was shaking for hours. Dodging a train was terrifying, but the fear that I had almost caused death stuck with me even more. That was our grand finale, not the one we wanted, but the one we deserved. A life lesson learned the hard way. Story 34. The scariest thing I have ever seen was while working outreach downtown one summer. I came across a well-dressed man overdosing in broad daylight. It was the first overdose I had ever witnessed, and it was terrifying. He was dripping with sweat, trying to get up but stumbling toward traffic, clearly unaware of where he was. His duffel bag was spilling with expensive electronics, and a spoon was sticking out of his pocket. It was shocking to see someone who looked like they had it together collapse in such a public, dangerous way. That memory is tied with another moment that shook me. Being on the subway with a friend and seeing a girl who couldn't have been more than 14 trying to talk to a group of older teenage boys. She was clearly drunk, slurring and asking them about her phone, saying she wanted to go with them. They were swearing at her, and it felt like a disaster about to happen. My friend and I got off the train with her, called her mom, and waited until she was picked up. But the thought of what could have happened still makes me sick. And then there was the night I was jolted awake by the sound of a blood-curdling scream outside my house. A biker had been hit by what we assumed was a drunk driver. I didn't see the accident myself, but my roommate went outside and came back devastated by what she saw. Each of those moments left me shaken in a different way, but all of them showed me how quickly life can turn terrifying. Story 35. About 10 years ago, we went camping at a lake where four boys, maybe 13 or 14 years old, decided to race across the water. Two of them made it to the other side quickly, but one got tired halfway across. The fourth boy stayed behind to help him, treading water and urging him on, but soon he too grew exhausted and had to continue without him. The boy left behind shouted that he couldn't stay afloat any longer, and then we saw his arms shoot straight up before he slipped under the surface. His mother, standing on shore, screamed for help, yelling that her son couldn't swim. None of us were strong swimmers, and the fear of not being able to make it ourselves stopped us from jumping in. I still carry guilt for that hesitation. His mother dove in, screaming desperately for him to hold on. Two men from our group then followed, swimming out with all their strength. They barely made it back, dragging the boy to shore, unconscious. I will never forget his face, those piercing blue eyes, wide open, staring blankly up at the summer sky. Someone called for help, and CPR began, but nothing worked for nearly an hour. Paramedics finally arrived, and just as we were leaving to get out of the way, they managed to get him breathing again. Later, we learned that his name was Jason. He made a full recovery and eventually joined the military. I still sometimes think about him and wonder how he's doing. But what will never leave me is the sound of his mother's screams, or the guilt I felt for not having the courage to jump in that day. Story 36. I live in the mountains of Pennsylvania, where I love taking night walks along the paths lit by the moon. On one of those nights, I heard rustling in the woods. At first, I thought nothing of it. It's common to see deer or stray cats around, but the rustling grew louder and seemed to follow me. Deer usually don't trail behind, so I started to feel uneasy. I glanced back but saw only blackness and trees. The feeling of being followed made me pick up my pace, my eyes locked on the area where I'd heard the sound. Then out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement, like a tree shifting. That's when I looked ahead and realized what it was. Just 10 feet in front of me stood a massive black bear. My stomach dropped. I instantly regretted not bringing a flashlight, my phone, or even one of my dogs. Frozen with fear, I forced myself to stay calm and move past it slowly. The bear didn't lunge or chase. It just stood there, following me with its head as I walked away. It kept its eyes locked on me all the way back until I finally reached home. I had no idea black bears could even get that big. It was an absolute giant, and that silent stare down was the scariest moment of my life. Story 37. A couple of years ago, I was driving home late at night with my dad after visiting my uncle. We were on a back road lined with fields and trees, the kind where you rarely see another car. Up ahead, we noticed a few trucks pulled over along the ditch. At first, we assumed it was just farmhands during harvest season, but as we got closer, we realized it was the aftermath of a car accident. A large pickup truck had crossed completely into the opposite lane and hit an SUV head-on. My dad rolled down the window to ask what happened, and a visibly shaken onlooker told us there were fatalities. People nearby were trying to help the girls in the back seat of the SUV, but without proper equipment, they couldn't get them out. We waited with the group until the first responders arrived. They asked us a few questions, but since we hadn't seen the actual crash, we couldn't offer much. Eventually, they directed us around the scene so we could continue home. Later, we learned more details. The pickup driver was a 17-year-old boy who survived with serious injuries. Everyone in the SUV, a pair of grandparents, their granddaughter, and her friend, died at the scene. I will never forget it, especially knowing the two younger girls likely spent their last moments waiting for help that never came in time. I had already been taught about the dangers of distracted driving, especially growing up in the era when smartphones were becoming common, but that night drove the lesson deep into me in a way I will never forget. Story 38. This one is still very fresh. On May 30th, 2021, I was riding in a side-by-side with two of my friends. We had just left her aunt's house, and my friend Neely was driving too fast. Our other friend Lana kept telling her to slow down, but before long we slid around a curve, hit something, and the vehicle flipped onto its side. Lana's head was caught underneath. Neely jumped out, and I followed. What we saw was horrific. Her neck bent unnaturally, blood coming from her head and nose. We were in shock. There was no cell service, and the first phone we found was Lana's. We didn't know what to do. Her grandfather eventually arrived and was able to call others. Those minutes we spent waiting felt endless. We kept trying to figure out how to help her, but there was nothing we could do. When the authorities showed up, they made us sit in the police car answering questions. They wouldn't let us go down to her, and even after the ambulance arrived, it took nearly an hour before they removed her. She was pronounced dead at the scene. I still can't process it. It doesn't feel real that one moment we were just riding together, and the next she was gone forever. Story 39. The scariest thing I have ever personally witnessed was what my church calls a deliverance, though most people would call it an exorcism. A family from our church came over for dinner before moving away from Florida. Their kids were playing video games in my room, and after a while I got bored and went to play on my computer. Suddenly I heard one of our dogs growl, followed by my mother screaming, "Pepper bit somebody." I thought maybe Pepper was just nervous around new people. Then I heard the sound of vomiting on the floor. I couldn't see what was happening from where I was, but I could hear everything. The girl Pepper had growled at began screaming. Horrific, guttural screams, unlike anything I'd ever heard. Her voice shifted unnaturally, saying things no 15-year-old should even know, let alone say. My parents, who knew how to pray for deliverance, began working with her. For what felt like an hour, the house was filled with screaming, praying, and chaos. Eventually, my parents succeeded in driving it out. When they came to check on me, they were shocked that I had stayed in the dining room, listening to it all. Later, when we cleaned up, I finally saw the vomit. We had eaten lasagna that night, but inside the mess was a strange, large, tan-colored circular object that didn't belong. My mom immediately threw it away without hesitation. To this day, I'll never forget the screams I heard or the eerie feeling that washed over the house. I'm just grateful I didn't let curiosity drive me to peek inside that second dining room while it was happening. Story 40. When I was a kid, my dad, my best friend, and I went out for our usual Friday dinner at Buca di Beppo. It was our tradition. My dad and I would go every week so we'd have leftovers for the weekend. After we finished and started walking home, my dad leaned down and whispered to us to hold his hands tight and not say a word. At first, I didn't understand why. We lived just a couple of blocks away, and the city was always busy at night, even in sketchier areas. But instead of heading straight home, we kept circling the block. After 20 minutes or so, I complained that I was tired, and my friend agreed. My dad asked if we wanted him to carry us, and once we said yes, he scooped us up and suddenly sprinted the rest of the way back to our house. When we got home, he called my friend's parents privately. Later, he sat us down and explained. He had noticed a man following us to the restaurant and then waiting to trail us as we walked home. That's why he kept circling the block and eventually ran the last stretch, so we would be safe. At the time, I didn't feel that scared because I had grown up talking to a lot of people living in the park near our place, some of whom were genuinely kind but just in bad situations. Looking back as an adult, though, it terrifies me. I can't stop thinking about what might have happened if my dad hadn't noticed, or if he hadn't acted so calmly. He never called the police. He didn't want to spook us or the man following us, and he figured they couldn't do much once we were already home. But that moment taught me to always stay aware of my surroundings.